Konnichiwa. Today we're going to look at a question that sometimes comes up because I deal with the Japanese language structurally, and people sometimes ask, does it help in understanding the granular structure of the language to know something about its history, to know where words come from? And my answer to that is a pragmatic one, because my whole approach is pragmatic. And the answer is, I would say most of the time, no, but some of the time, yes. I'm assuming that most people watching these videos want to learn to use Japanese, read it, hear it, speak it, write it, and are not fundamentally interested in the history of the language. If we are interested in the history of the language, that's a different matter. Purely from the perspective of acquiring the language, it's cluttering our minds with information we don't particularly need. But there are times when it becomes very useful to know something about the history of the language, and times when structural puzzles can't be completely solved without it. And I'll try to give you a heads up where that's the case and give you the necessary information. There are also times, which may seem strange, when not so much the actual history of the language, but folk history, etymological ideas that aren't actually correct, can be very useful. That sounds strange, I know, but why is it? Well, it's because one of the things about the history of the language, and why it often isn't very useful, is that it's not telling us about how the language works now, it's telling us about how the language used to work a few hundred years ago. And we don't particularly need to know that. On the other hand, folk etymology, ideas about the origins of words that aren't actually historically true, tend to represent more recent people's ideas about how the language really does work now. And since these folk etymologies are coming out of Japanese-speaking people in a Japanese environment, they tend to be colored by Japanese people's appreciation of how the language works now, rather than how it used to work back when the words were formed. So, we're going to take a couple of examples, and we'll start off with one in which the real history of the language is useful to us. And I'm going to take a comment from Algerion-san, who commented, one of the words that confused me a bit is domo. It's often used as a greeting. However, I imagine its literal meaning is along the lines of in any way. It's probably not that critical an issue, but I still wonder how it gets to hello from there. Now, this is an interesting question, and it's not that critical an issue when we're talking about the more usual meanings of domo, when it means thank you or something like that. It does become more of a critical issue when we look at another meaning that it has, which seems to be quite unrelated, but actually isn't. When we look in a dictionary, we find a lot of definitions for domo. Thank you, thanks, much, very, and also things like somehow, in spite of oneself, try as one might, no matter how one may try, to do or not to do. And as you see, they seem to be quite unrelated to the more common meanings of the word. And it helps us a good deal to know where domo actually came from. One of the reasons I quoted Algerion-san's comment is that he actually got the structure right. I imagine the literal meaning is along the lines of in any way, and it is. The trouble here is that unless we know a little more about the history, that doesn't take us far enough. Domo actually begins in the Edo era, and it's a contraction of the expression domo ienu, and that means in any way. The domo part means in any way, and ienu means unable to say. That negativizing nu is something I've talked about in a recent video, so if you don't know about that, I'll put a link above my head. And in most of the more common uses, this was used in the Edo period along with the word hodo. And I've made a recent video about hodo as well, so I'll link that. So, domo ienu hodo. Domo ienu means I'm not able in any way to say. Domo ienu hodo means to the extent that I'm not able in any way to say. And now we start to see how this applied to the commonest uses of domo. Domo arigatou gozaimasu means not just thank you, but I'm thankful to a degree, Hodo, that I'm unable in any means to express. I'm inexpressibly grateful. Domo sumimasen. I'm inexpressibly sorry. Now, of course, this is a hyperbole, and as always happens with hyperboles, when they become settled into the language as regular expressions, it loses a lot of its force, so it ends up just meaning very. So, domo sumimasen, I'm very sorry. Domo arigatou gozaimasu, thank you very much. And this gets attached to basic set expressions like aisatsu, to the point where it can be used to replace the aisatsu, even in cases where it wouldn't be clear what the aisatsu is. So we can use domo to replace goodbye and hello aisatsu. We're just saying very much. I'm very happy to be seeing you. I'm very much looking forward to meeting again. It's just become a kind of general aisatsu stand-in, and it's a very useful one, because being somewhat effusive, it seems pleasant and polite. It's not over-formal, it's not over-informal. It's just a very useful expression to throw in place of an aisatsu. Of course, it replaces the ones where it makes more logical sense. So we can say domo for I'm sorry, and domo for thank you. So these are the commoner uses. Now the other meanings in the dictionary, somehow, in spite of oneself, no matter how hard one might try to or try not to, that kind of thing. We can see that this is in fact domo ienu without the hodo. We're just saying domo ienu. I can't by any means express. So if we say domo ochitsukanai, somehow I just can't calm down, can't settle down. Domo, somehow, which is originally domo ienu. I can't in any way say why, but I can't settle down. Domo kokyū ga awanai. Somehow we just don't get on. Our breaths don't come together, literally. Somehow we just don't get on. I can't possibly say why that is, but somehow that's the case. And from there on, if we can't do something or we don't end up doing something, and no matter how hard we try to do it or not do it, doesn't come about, domo ienu. I can't say why, but that's just how it is. So this is how domo comes to have such a wide range of meanings. And if we link it back to that, just that concept of not in any way being able to express, we can see how it all came about, and I think it makes it much easier to understand and manage. Now, the one where we're going to talk about a false etymology is yappari, which also takes a slightly more formal form, yahari. It's rather like nihon, which also can be said as nippon. Yahari can be said as yappari. And the most usual way in which we hear this is meaning just as we thought, just as we understood. So, if Sakura does something very silly, we might say, yappari, Sakura wa baka nano ne. Just as we thought, Sakura's an idiot. Now, another way we often hear it in immersion, anime, other places, is when a feeling wells up inside us and very often changes our mind. So, for example, if our heroine looks at a scary house and she says, oh, that's really scary, I'm not going in there, and then she makes up her mind, steels her nerve, and says, right, I'm going in. Yosh, ikuzo! And in she marches, she opens the door, looks around and says, yappari kawaii, and decides not to go in after all. Now what's going on here? The dictionary once again gives it quite a wide range of meanings, some of which we hear less often, but all of which are part of the meaning of the word, like still, as before, even so, either way, nonetheless, etc. How does all this fit into yappari? Now, there is a folk etymology for yappari. Yappari is written in kanji like this. Don't write it like this because you'll look like someone who's done Heisig and has no idea what's written in kanji and what isn't. But these are the kanji, yahari. As you see, we have an arrow, and we have the kanji for stretching or straining or tightening. And these kanji aren't in fact the original kanji and were apparently only used for the sound. So the folk etymology here isn't historically accurate. But what it states is that the kanji, which are for pulling an arrow tight on a bow, what happens when we pull an arrow tight on a bow? Well, at this point we're focusing, aren't we, on the target. And in Zen archery, and Japanese archery is rather based in Zen, we're supposed to see nothing but that target. Now, suppose we are distracted. Suppose we look around, see something, hear something rustling, somebody speaks to us. If we're good archers, immediately after that we go back to the yahari, the stretched bow, the target beyond which we see nothing else. So, the idea is returning to our original focus. This is what we mean when we're talking about Sakura. We always thought she was an idiot, and yappari, she is an idiot. It also works with feelings, which are a stronger focus in a way than thoughts. So if something felt scary in the first place, then we decide to go and face it, and then when we get there, yappari, it is scary. We're pulled back to our original focus. Now, what we do about this depends on us. We may then decide not to go in, we may decide to go in. But either way, we've been pulled back to that yappari, that original focus. So what about these other dictionary definitions? As is often the case with English dictionary definitions, these aren't really things that yahari, yappari actually means, so much as English expressions whose meaning spectrum overlaps with that of yahari at certain points. So when we take the words either and also, which actually mean the same thing in certain contexts in English, it's just that English uses one word for the negative and another for the positive, which Japanese doesn't. So for example, if we say yahari, and in cases like this it is usually yahari, boku mo minai, I didn't see it either. What's that yahari doing there? Well, of course we don't say I didn't see it either, unless the other person has said they didn't see it. So what we're doing here is returning to the original focus of the conversation. You didn't see it? Well, stressing the point by saying that we're returning back to that focus. I didn't see it either. Boku mo yahari ikimashita. I went too. I also went. Again, the other person has said that they went, and we stress the mo by saying yahari, returning to the original focus of this part of the conversation, to the fact that you went. Well, yahari, original focus, I went too. And it can be used for concepts beyond even what the dictionaries draw it out to. For example, it can mean predictably, yappari, ame ga furidashita. Now in this case, we may not have been specifically thinking it was going to rain, but what we're saying is, well, everyone knows it rains on these occasions. So going back to what might have been our original focus, if we'd had one, yappari, ame ga furidashita. Or as you might say in English, just as you might have expected, it rained. So I hope that helps with these very common words. And fortunately, I would say, it's not that often that we need to know historical information outside of the ordinary structure of a word in order to understand it. But obviously there are cases, especially with expressions drawn from proverbs and things like that, where it helps to know the proverb. And in some cases with actual words like this, where it helps to know what domo originally meant. And in the case of yappari, it's a concept that we don't really have in English, this original focus concept. And even though it's a folk etymology, not a historical etymology, it really helps us to understand how Japanese people see and understand that expression. If you have any questions or comments or any other words that you'd like to hear explained, please let me know in the comments below. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. It's wonderful having you together with me, supporting me so that we can delve into these mysteries, find out what we need to know in order to move our understanding of the language forward. And I'm very grateful that you're making it possible for me to do so. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.